Hey, it's Freitag. In this podcast, we interview business owners in New Hampshire and beyond to get their perspective on work, growth, and of course, the weekend. Join our host, Freitag marketing owner Jan Ziegler, as he interviews fascinating guests. We hope you'll enjoy this episode.
Welcome to another episode of It's Freitag. Today with Mark Bodin, who's the president of the Savings Bank of Walpole. Welcome, Mark.
Welcome. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So I usually kick it off with, how did you end up here? I stalked your LinkedIn like I do for research, and you were at Leadership Monadnock a couple of weeks ago, and you told us about how you ended up, you were in New York City, then you were in a nonprofit world for a long time. How did you end up being the president of a small local bank in rural New Hampshire?
Yeah, well, I was at Franklin Pierce last weekend talking about careers, and I talked to two classes, and the first thing I told them is that careers are not a direct line, So, yeah, I'm from New York City, grew up, and went to high school during the energy crisis and was in one of the largest high schools in the country with 5,000 students, so it's pretty anonymous there. Worked my way through, worked in New York City in one of the largest international accounting firms, worked for a Fortune 500 company. And my wife and I looked at each other and realized we were on the fast track to a heart attack. And it was time to change our life philosophy from living where we work to working where we live. So we said, where do we want to live? And we're outdoors oriented people. We were coming up to Vermont a lot. We looked at Colorado and decided Vermont was it. So moved up here, said people figure out how to make it work. We had no idea how we would do that. Ended up finding a small nonprofit at the time that was looking for a CFO, and it's the Student Conservation Association. I was there for 16 years. It's where I found that work, you can combine your passion, with work and do things that are interesting to you. We work with young people and conservation and putting them together and working in public lands. So my business trips, I used to bring a tent often and bring backpacks and got to see so many of the most beautiful parks in the country and fish and wildlife areas. And just that was wonderful. And in the time I was there, we grew from a $6 million annual budget to 40. We were at the beginning of the AmeriCorps program. So it was really rewarding. And then the Great Recession came and things got tough. And, after rounds of layoffs, with our staffs, I just realized that the easiest thing to do would probably be to take my position out. So that seemed noble until I realized that the unemployment rate in 2010, was like up towards 10%. And noble turned into what now?
Well, also finance was not like the most favorite area of anybody's hiring at that point.
Yeah, I never considered going to a bank. I thought I would be like a lion tamer before I would go to a bank. And, I had different networks working for me and people said, hey, there's this opening at this bank, Savings Bank of Walpole. And at the time, I probably hadn't even been in a bank to cash a check, in 10 years. And I said, no, that's a bank. I'm not interested. And they said, no, it's not like a bank. They do all these great things. And I said, no, literally, the middle name is bank. And, they're like, no, you should check it out. And I did and went in and first passed through. I was like, wow, this is a cool little bank, but, I don't think I have the experience for it. And they called me back, right? Literally that day and said, no, we have plenty of people that know how to run banks, but you know how to run organizations. So, it's mission-based. And after a few conversations with the CEO at the time, I said, all right, let's take a chance on each other and do it. So all of a sudden, I was in banking, not necessarily proud of it at the moment, but man, I was so wrong. As time went on, I see this bank here really is about, doing the right things by people and that, financial services is noble. So, I feel like I went from, where the organization I was with was national. So I'd go everywhere and I'd visit crews. I did the best travel and met the best people, but I always left while they stayed and did things. And here I traded in breadth for depth. And I saw that I can get involved more and more, in things. And I started as CFO of the bank. And when you're CFO, nobody really cares about getting you involved in things. I was just working in the basement in Walpole. And I've been in this role as president for almost 7 years, now. So, and it's been a trip.
So in your more than a decade back in banking and at SBW here, What have you seen changed? I mean, I think obviously everything's more digital. People like probably come in even less into the bank because they can do it all from their cell phones. But how has banking changed like post-financial crisis, like especially for this community?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have, like, most people in banking have been in it for 25, 30 years. And for me, although I've been in it 14, I still seem like I came in later, and don't have as much history. But what I've seen is I've seen basically the world open up for us, competitively as other banks move away. And it's happening right now. We've increased, I mean, since I've been at SBW, we've added 3 branches, 2 in the last 3 or 4 years. And, so for us, our niche is being present and being right here in the community. So meeting the needs of people is amazing. And while most banks have had decreases in terms of foot traffic, and we have as well, if you go back over the years, but our branches are busy and because we're convenient, right there. But people also like our people. So I feel that our competition has basically opened it up, for us to step in and say, hey, we could be like businesses were, that corner hardware store, it doesn't exist. We can be that still.
Well, because I think that and, probably for all these national banks, it's the economies of scale. They say, every branch that we can close saves us X amount of money, but we only lose a small percentage of those customers because most people don't go into banks. And so that leaves this huge door for somebody to actually embrace that local and just focus it on this small little region here. Is that a model that is now very successful, like across New England, across the country, that local banks kind of have like another growth period right now?
Well, I think the last few years have been hard for banks with interest rates being so high. We actually are in a great position where, for us, I mean, we've always been known as a deposit-heavy bank. Like, our local customers are loyal, and our deposits have always grown. So we have a lot of liquidity going into these higher rate environment where most banks actually borrow money. And so if you borrowed money and it went from, it went up 5.25%, like overnight almost. So a lot of banks have seen their margins really shrink and they've had to look at other ways to do things and make hard decisions. We've thrived. I mean, our earnings have literally doubled, in the last few years. So we've been in good position. Overall, though, I do think the model of, being on the ground and having others leave while you come in has been really powerful. We have a couple of sister banks, and between us, we've opened 6 or 7 branches in the last 4 years.
Just in New Hampshire?
Yeah, just in New Hampshire. So, and we're not an overlapping market. So we see being present and being on the ground and serving the needs of your community in a lot of ways, as being a model that is powerful for us. And we're all growing and strong.
The thing that I find so cool about you is that you don't just talk about like, local community engagement. You don't just, throw a bunch of money into all the sponsorships and nonprofits. So you like have the big logo. Is like you really translate that into like team culture and getting not just yourself, but like the entire staff actively involved, not just writing checks, which would be much easier probably.
Yeah, I think, when I came into this role 7 years ago, this bank had always been involved in the community, but it always was kind of onesies and all over the place. And when I came in, I just saw a big opportunity to take what I learned in my nonprofit world and, said, this is the perfect like test tube. This is the perfect environment and laboratory to test that. I have a philosophy that communities let businesses off the hook too easy. It's just easy to say they only care about themselves, they only care about profits. And I don't think communities should say that. I think communities should be looking to businesses to do something. So when I came in, I created a community engagement department, which at the time was one person who was our community engagement coordinator, and, said, all right, here's the vision. The vision is we want to work towards that. And we had 3 pillars to work towards. The first was the belief that community engagement was good for business. The second was the belief that community engagement and letting staff engage in things that were important to them would enrich the staff experience. And I've learned that in my nonprofit world. And the third pillar was, it's the right thing to do. So we'd have done it for number 3. And I think most businesses, that stay involved, do it for number 3. But what a waste, to not take advantage of 1 and 2. And what my assumption at the time is once you prove that works, it becomes part of your business model. And when it becomes part of your business model, you don't go up and down when times are good and bad. So when the pandemic came, we doubled down, not just because it was right, which is really why we did it, but we knew that, the local papers and radio stations were going to have a decrease in advertising because businesses were shutting down. So we didn't want to do that. So we kept going. We kept doing things. We did things to engage our staff because we were viewed as an essential business. And we never talked about ourselves. Interestingly, we said, let's just talk about the community. We had this one word campaign, resilience and commitment and all those things. And we just really used the opportunity to stay involved. And what we found is during the pandemic, people came up to us early on and everybody was telling us, you guys are everywhere. And we would say, well, we're literally nowhere because there's nothing going on. But they said, no, every place we go, Savings Bank of Walpole is involved. And we just kept doing it because it felt right, to do that. And what we've seen now that we've come out of the pandemic in those years is we did it for the right reasons. We're involved in everything. And we haven't gone back. I mean, we're still giving it those double down, levels. What we found is that our business levels, we used to bring in about 800 new customers a year who brought in about 20 million of deposits. And we thought that was great in a no growth market. Since then, for 4 straight years, we brought in 1,700 customers a year who brought in $40 to $48 million. So we've more than doubled our business, there, because people come in and they say, I want to keep my money local. Who says that?
And I think I think it's especially true in like a time of crisis like COVID, because everybody feels it, right? Like all the businesses feel it. And then if you keep supporting local businesses, if you keep supporting the organizations, they remember that because everybody else is pulling back. So you're the only one left standing. And I think it's super interesting that you say that you have like these 3 pillars and one of them is it's the right thing to do, but it's also good for business. If you think about it that way, it makes it much easier to justify the spending, even if times are bad, right? Because otherwise it's your discretionary sponsorship donation fund, which is the first thing that goes when times are bad. And you just bake it in and say, no, we need to keep doing that because it's going to come back around. Did you expect that, or were you also just very surprised that had this positive effect in terms of growth?
I'd say the pandemic, we were genius in hindsight. We didn't know we were being genius at the time. And, so in terms of whether we expected that to happen, I would say it was my theory. And, it was more my vision. And I've never woke up any morning, probably including this morning, wanting to be president of anything. But when I looked at the opportunity at Savings Bank of Walpole to step in there, I was like, I could actually try this, and do it. And our community engagement coordinator, who went in at the time, she has been promoted 4 times. Since then, now is vice president of community engagement and marketing. She's sat on our senior leadership team of the bank for the last probably 3 years. She has a staff of 2 others, so there's 3 of them working in community engagement. And we found that presence is a key strategy for us. So it isn't, as you said, it's not just writing a check. Writing a check is important because, I know from my nonprofit days, no money, no mission. But for us, it's not just writing a check, it's actually participating. We had a lot of people at the home show this past weekend, and it goes with everything. When events come, whether it's a race or the DeMar, we have like 40 people, who volunteer at the DeMar. And, we just view involvement as something that enriches, people's experience. And we're strategic about it. We look at events coming up and we look at board openings and say, where should we be? And for certain of them, no, we want somebody at management to be there. We want someone who can really explain lending, at it. And so we want to be there. We want to be there with the right people. We don't judge our staff at all. It is not a factor in promotions or advancement, whether they participate or not. We don't take attendance, although we have to track it for banking purposes. But, for us, it's just, if you're interested in it, do it. And otherwise, we know a lot of people have other commitments in life. Tonight and the first Monday of every month, we do community kitchen, volunteer. So I'll be there tonight, which is always just, it's really fun because when you're volunteering with people, there also is no rank. The fact that I'm president of the bank doesn't matter at all.
Well, and I think that's a brilliant thing, right? Because if you think about a bank, right, you think about like people sitting in their ivory tower somewhere in Manhattan and like Jamie Dimon wearing a very expensive suit. And when he ever volunteers, if he ever does, it's this huge photo op, right? But you're basically bringing that completely down, be like, no, we're part of the community. Like, even though we hold all the money for the region, we're part of the community just like anybody else. And like, we don't act like we're super businessy important bankers because we're just community members. And I think that's like, with that disconnect, like you're just leveraging that perfectly in explaining like to the community kind of like how this all works. I think it's fascinating, and I think it's fascinating that it works so well for probably both, personal deposits, but then also for business accounts. Because I mean, I just talked to you myself. I'm like, oh, this is like, we didn't have our accounts at SBW. Now we do, because we're like, this, like, it's stupid not to. Like at TD, they don't care about our deposits. So yeah, cool. So what is like, you have this master plan. It's worked now for 4 or 5 years. Do you have any exciting plans for like the next 5, or are you're like, this is success, we're going to keep doing what we're doing, or we're going to lean deeper into it? What's kind of the take?
Yeah, just tell you on your ivory tower comment, when I worked in New York, I had an office overlooking Central Park. Now there's nothing that'll humble you more than I look outside my office and I see a vape shop. So, there's, keep you humble, right? Doing that. I think for the next, few years, I mean, we just went through a strategic planning process, which we do every, 3 years or so. And I'm big on vision, and I think a vision is more important than your plan of where you want to go. And I have, if you just use this math equation, 1 vision equals 3 strategic plans. So if you do 3-year plans, it literally takes you 3 plans to get to a 10-year vision. And the good thing is when we looked at, the plan now, we said, all right, well, our vision is really largely the same, although we've gone through this harder time in banking. And so this is plan number 2, under the same vision. So I think in a lot of ways, it's still a continuation towards there, but the world changes. So you can't have the same strategies. I think something that we haven't done well enough yet in our past, and this is our 150th year anniversary. So it's like, I keep saying it's taken us 150 years, but we're still like more like a teenager, in terms of where we are in our evolution, and we have to keep evolving and keep growing. And working with businesses, I think, we've always really done an amazing job with individuals. I think we've done a really, really good job with businesses, but we've always looked at businesses of whether they're lending customers or not. And now we're just looking at businesses as businesses, and so our lending departments and our retail banking departments are working together better than ever, which sounds really logical, and because it is, so we're doing that better. On the community front, I just had a conversation the other day, with our team there, and said, all right, what's community engagement 2.0? I said, we're doing great stuff and we're not going to abandon anything. And we've added an education component, which again, we've always done kind of opportunistically or when we were asked. But now we're intentionally doing a lot more financial education in the community. So we've added that as maybe that's, 1.1 or 1.2. But, where do we go, in terms of we've always been involved in other people's issues and other people's organizations. And we view that as a community bank. We're here to serve all of our community, whether we agree with the point of view or not. My job it's not my bank. I'm just a steward, and I think there's been 17 presidents before me and there'll be 17 after me. So my job is just to advance the brand, for the next person. I think that looking at community engagement 2.0, who knows, what it'll be. And, I loved a couple of weeks ago, we had like 30 staff go out, and there was the Rotaract did the meal packing program. We packed like 40,000 meals in a few hours, along with a whole lot of community members. And I was like, that's awesome. Is it, food insecurity is an issue that we should take up and support? I have no idea, what is yet, but I think that's the area we can move forward on more than anything.
I have one quick question, and we can cut this out if you don't want to talk about it, because I think it's a little bit tricky. Because like, one thing that I think about a lot is that we have this incredibly deep nonprofit landscape here that's incredibly well funded, mostly thanks to like 2 families and maybe the bank, but like to very few individuals who like just have a very outsized wealth that they can, and that they use for good here in the community. So we have like this landscape that is, one could say, negatively, artificially propped up. And they're aging. Maybe their kids aren't around. Maybe that is not going to continue like it is right now forever. Do you think that's a big risk to because we have amazing organizations here. We have, but they're all bigger than they should be in Keene, New Hampshire, because we have more money than we would normally have. Do you think that's a big risk?
I mean, it's definitely a risk. I mean, there's no upside, to it. I think that those families are committed to this area, and I think that will extend beyond their physical, presence here. And they've made some amazing commitments, here that I think will keep boosting us. Honestly, nowadays, I think the threat to federal funding, for a lot of our nonprofits in the area is probably greater, from an immediate, perspective, looking 10 years down the line. I just feel like this community, everything we built here is outsized. I think you're right. Like I look at it, and from my nonprofit background, I look at the capital campaigns that go through and the things we build. I'm like, it makes no sense. It beats every formula. And again, some of it it's propped up, by a few donors.
I mean, I look at like the Y, for example. It's an incredible facility, right? And we have an $80 family membership. There's no break even there. And I think and there's so many like that. We have these incredible institutions that are like a core part, and people use them, people love them. And I saw this the other day. It was like the Forbes came out, the Coens were on the list, and like people had so many negative comments, like in local Facebook groups. And I'm like, you all don't know, do you? Like the lack of awareness. They're like, all billionaires are bad. I'm like, well, this one isn't. I mean, and it's funny that people are so unaware when, I know for me, and for you probably also, it's so obvious that they have such a huge amount of input here for the community.
I think we get into that whole societal division soundbite, thing. And, in terms of what is bad and that people haven't earned their way to where they are. And the reality is it's a mix, just like everything else. Some people did, some people didn't. And, we deal with that as a bank. I mean, there's a lot of things that come out. And even, a few weeks ago on February 28th, when it was that boycott business thing, I mean, I was, some of the things that came out, oh, banks are bad and everything. And I responded to some and said, look, I'm writing this with love, but this is, it's just not so. I mean, there's a whole lot of people that work within these companies. Forget the companies because they're not feeling, but there's a lot of people within these companies like ours that work really hard to be everything against what you just said, and to stereotype and lump everybody together. And you say like, oh, banks are bad. And you're like, well, not our bank. Our bank's good. Well, we don't mean your bank, but you said banks are bad. And I think it's the same with people, of wealth. I mean, some of them use it really well. And the fact that locally, the families that use their wealth for probably clearly more good than anyone, realize is, I mean, they're also pretty anonymous about it. So I always say true service is what you do when nobody's looking. And they're doing that. So yeah, I think, when that passes, it will, I think that they'll leave things well standing. But again, I don't think most people have any idea of how much they have to do with all the wonderful things, that we built here.
You're completely right that like people are largely unaware. And I find that this is something I think about a lot. It's like they're doing so much, good with the money that they have, more than like most other organizations could do or would be able to. So I want to switch gears a little bit. And we, in this podcast, it's called It's Freitag. Freitag is Friday in German. And we always talk a little bit about what a good weekend looks like here in the region. I mean, I love it here, and I've moved here recently. But what do you do on a perfect weekend?
I'm an outdoors person. My wife and I, we moved to this area by choice, and it was really driven by our outdoor ethic. So, our kids are grown now. They're 29 and 25. It's hard to say that and imagine that that's true. But, our lives were built around them, for a long time. And in our, days where we're empty nesters, we try to get outside, as much as we can. I actually live across the river in Vermont. I live up high where we have more snow than others. So we try to extend our winter as much as possible and just go snowshoeing out our door and do things. But we like to hike and kayak and bike and get outside. And to me, that's the weekend, whenever possible. But as I've gotten older, chilling out a little bit, which is something I never thought I'd ever admit, isn't a bad thing, on some of these lousy weather weekends. But that's, for us, I mean, it usually is chasing us outdoors is what people would have to do to catch us.
Okay. And then you're outdoors mostly in the faraway state of Vermont, or do you come over this way sometimes?
I do both. I mean, I spend, for me, weekends are more in the kingdom of Vermont, over there, but I do a lot after work. We for years, we started this during the pandemic. Staff engagement is a huge thing at the bank, and we're trying to figure out how to engage, during that time. So we started an outdoor club. So, a lot of us, we would just go kayaking, which is something you can bring your families because their kids had nothing to do. So we'd start kayaking, in the area, and we'd hike in the area. So, there's so many great things here. So I try to do my things on the right side of the river, during the week. And, otherwise when I'm home, I hit the other side.
That's lovely. I always find this river, like, I live right on the river, and it's such a deep divide. It's like the world ends with the Connecticut River. So thank you, Mark. I really appreciated your time and coming here and talking to us about banking, which is more interesting than I thought it would be because it's banking. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was fun.
Well, that was a great conversation. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please leave us a nice review wherever you're listening to this. It really means the world. Our episodes drop every other Friday, so stay tuned for more insightful chats from It's Freitag.